You should know what happened this 1816 and why it is the most important event in history, the year without a summer. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Imagine stepping outside on what should be the warmest day of July, only to feel a biting chill that cuts straight through your coat. Snowflakes drift down from a sky that refuses to brighten, frost coats the fields that were supposed to be bursting with ripening wheat, and the sun itself looks pale and weak, as if it has forgotten how to shine. This wasn't some local oddity or a bad dream. This was reality for millions of people across Europe and North America in the year 1816, a year that history would forever remember as the year without a summer. What makes 1816 not just mysterious, but arguably the single most important year in the entire sweep of modern history is this. A single cataclysmic event on the other side of the planet triggered a chain reaction that rewrote weather patterns, toppled governments, sparked mass migrations, inspired immortal works of literature, and left scars on human civilization that we still feel today. It wasn't war, it wasn't revolution in the usual sense, it wasn't even a plague in the traditional way. It was the weather itself turning against humanity on a global scale, and the cause was so enormous, so violent, and so perfectly timed that it felt almost supernatural to those who lived through it. Yet science would later reveal the truth, and that truth is more astonishing than any ghost story. Let's travel back together step by step and live through every frozen morning, every failed harvest, every desperate decision that people made when the world refused to warm up. We will walk the muddy roads of New England, stand in the empty marketplaces of Switzerland, feel the hunger gnawing at families in Germany and France, and watch as artists and writers, trapped indoors by endless rain, gave birth to Frankenstein and the modern vampire. By the time we finish this 10-part journey, you will understand why 1816 deserves its place as the pivot point between the old world and the new, why it changed the course of empires, economies, and even the way we tell stories about monsters. To understand how a single year could matter so much, we have to begin not in 1816 itself, but 13 months earlier on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia. It is April 5th, 1815. The mountain known as Tambora has been rumbling for weeks, but on this day it decides to announce its fury to the world. First comes a series of loud explosions that are heard more than 800 miles away in Java. Then on April 10th, the real apocalypse begins. Tambora, a volcano that had stood over 14,000 feet tall, literally blows its top in the largest eruption in recorded human history. 4 times more powerful than the famous Krakatoa eruption of 1883, it ejects an estimated 150 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and gas straight into the atmosphere. The sound is heard 1,600 miles away. Entire kingdoms on the island are wiped out in hours. Rivers of superheated mud race down the slopes, burying villages. The sky turns black for days, but the real killer isn't the lava or the immediate blast, it's what Tambora sends skyward. Tens of millions of tons of sulfur dioxide, ash, and aerosols shoot up more than 25 miles into the stratosphere, far above where weather normally happens. There in the cold upper atmosphere, these particles spread out in a vast veil that circles the entire planet within weeks. This veil doesn't just block sunlight, it reflects it back into space. It's like throwing a giant sunshade over the Earth. Scientists today call this a volcanic winter, and Tambora's was the most severe in at least 500 years, possibly the worst in 2,000 years. The particles would stay aloft for 2 full years, slowly drifting and mixing, slowly turning summer into winter everywhere in the northern hemisphere. But in 1815, no one knew any of this. The world was still reeling from the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had just been defeated at Waterloo in June 1815, and Europe was trying to rebuild. The United States was recovering from the War of 1812. People were exhausted, poor, and hopeful that peace would finally bring prosperity. No one suspected that a mountain on the far side of the globe had just sentenced them to a year of starvation. By late 1815, the first strange signs appeared, but they were dismissed as quirks. In Europe, the winter of 1815–1816 was unusually cold and snowy, but winters can be cold. Then came spring. In March, farmers in France and Germany plowed their fields under gray skies that never seemed to clear. April brought frost. May was worse, but it was June that broke people's minds. Picture this. It is June 6, 1816, in the Green Mountains of Vermont. A farmer named Thomas Jefferson, no relation to the former president but a solid Yankee nonetheless, wakes up to find his fields covered in 2 inches of snow. Snow, in June, in New England. He rubs his eyes, steps outside in his nightshirt, and feels the flakes melting on his skin. Across the state line in New Hampshire, diaries record flurries on the 7th and 8th. In Maine, ice forms on ponds. Further south, in Connecticut, a diarist writes in astonishment, "We had a snow storm this morning." The ground was covered and the trees loaded with snow. The same thing is happening across the Atlantic. In Switzerland, the Alps are still buried under winter snow that refuses to melt. Rivers swell with cold rain that never stops. In Germany, the Rhine freezes in places it never should. France, already struggling after years of war, watches its wheat fields turn black with frost on June 9th. One French newspaper reports that the cold is so intense that the birds fall dead from the trees. But June is supposed to be the beginning of summer. Farmers plant anyway, hoping it's a fluke. They sow corn, potatoes, oats, barley, they pray. And for a few days in late June, the sun peaks out and temperatures rise into the 70s. Hope surges. Then July arrives and the nightmare returns with a vengeance. July 4th, 1816. While Americans are celebrating Independence Day with picnics and fireworks, a massive cold front slams into the eastern seaboard. In Philadelphia, the temperature drops to 44 degrees Fahrenheit. In New York City, people wake to frost on their windows. In Virginia, snow falls again. Across New England, every single night in early July brings killing frost. Corn stalks that had begun to tassel turn brown and die overnight. Potato plants blacken. In Vermont, one farmer writes in his journal, "This is the most extraordinary season ever known. We have had snow and frost every month this year." Now let's cross the ocean again to Europe, where the suffering is even more immediate and deadly. In Ireland, which had already endured centuries of hardship, the summer of 1816 brings endless rain, not just showers but weeks of torrential downpours that rot the potatoes still in the ground. The oat crop fails completely. People begin to starve by August. In France, the wheat harvest is less than half of normal. Bread prices, already high after the wars, triple and then quadruple. In Paris, riots break out as hungry crowds storm bakeries. The government, still fragile after Napoleon's fall, is forced to import grain from Russia at enormous cost. Germany is hit perhaps hardest of all. The Kingdom of Bavaria reports that the summer was so cold that the sun was scarcely visible. Snow falls on the harvest in August. Rivers flood repeatedly, destroying what little grows. In the Swiss Alps, glaciers advance visibly down the valleys, swallowing pastures that had been green for centuries. Mountain passes that were normally open in summer remain blocked by snow into September. Travelers are trapped for weeks in remote inns, running out of food while outside the wind howls and the rain turns to sleet. And all the while, no one understands why. Newspapers speculate wildly. Some blame sunspots. Others say it's the result of the recent war, that the cannon fire at Waterloo somehow disturbed the atmosphere. A few religious leaders preach that it is God's judgment on a sinful Europe that had dared to follow Napoleon. Scientists in London and Paris begin to notice strange reddish sunsets and hazy skies, but they have no idea the cause is a volcano half a world away. The mystery deepens every single day. Now let's zoom in on one particular place that would become legendary because of this year, a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. It is June 1816 and the rain has been falling almost without pause for weeks. A group of brilliant but scandalous young people are trapped indoors. There is Lord Byron, the famous poet, handsome, lame, and already notorious across Europe. With him is his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori. Staying nearby is Percy Bysshe Shelley, the radical poet, and his young lover Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who is only 18 years old but already carrying Percy's child. Also with them is Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont, They had come to Switzerland for a romantic summer of boating and hiking. Instead, they are prisoners of the weather. The lake is gray and stormy. The mountains are hidden by clouds. Day after day, they sit around the fire, reading ghost stories aloud, drinking, arguing about science and philosophy. One night, Byron proposes a contest. Each of them will write a ghost story. What happens next is pure magic born from misery. Mary Godwin, later to become Mary Shelley, lies awake night after night, her mind racing with images of creation and horror. She later writes that the idea came to her in a waking dream. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life. From that vision, trapped by the endless cold rain of 1816, would come the novel Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Published in 1818, it would change literature forever and give the world its most enduring monster. Meanwhile, Byron himself writes a short story called A Fragment, which becomes the seed for the first modern vampire tale. Polidori expands it into the vampire, introducing the aristocratic bloodsucker that would inspire Dracula decades later. Percy Shelley writes poetry about the raging storms outside. The cold, the darkness, the sense that nature itself had turned hostile, infused every word they wrote. Without the year, without a summer, we might never have had Frankenstein. The monster was literally born from volcanic ash. But while artists in Switzerland were creating immortal stories, ordinary people were fighting for survival. In the United States, the cold wave of 1816 triggered one of the largest internal migrations in early American history. Thousands of farmers in New England and upstate New York, facing total crop failure, packed their wagons and headed west. They crossed the Allegheny Mountains into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, seeking the fertile lands of the Midwest where they hoped the climate might be kinder. Historians estimate that over 15,000 people left Vermont alone between 1816 and 1817. Entire villages were abandoned. This westward push accelerated the settlement of the frontier and helped shape the future expansion of the United States. The year without a summer literally redrew the map of America. In Europe, the famine and cold sparked political unrest that would echo for decades. In France, the poor harvests contributed to the fall of the restored Bourbon monarchy in later years. In Germany and Austria, food riots turned into political demonstrations. Some historians argue that the economic dislocation caused by 1816 helped plant the seeds for the revolutions of 1848. Even in China and Japan, on the other side of the planet, the volcanic veil caused crop failures and famine, though the effects were less documented at the time. Back in North America, the strange weather continued into 1817. In April 1817, snow still fell in Quebec. Rivers that should have been swollen with spring melt remained frozen. But slowly, as the stratospheric particles finally settled out of the atmosphere, the sun began to regain its strength. By the summer of 1817, normal weather returned. The crisis was over, but the damage was done. Millions had gone hungry. Hundreds of thousands had died from starvation and disease. Economies were shattered, and humanity had received a terrifying lesson. The planet is far more fragile and far more connected than anyone had imagined. Yet even as the skies cleared, the mystery lingered. How could one mountain cause all this? It would take another 150 years and the development of modern climate science before geologists and atmospheric scientists could piece together the evidence. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica would reveal the massive spike in sulfuric acid exactly in the layers corresponding to 1815-1816. Tree rings from around the world would show stunted growth in 1816. Historical weather records, painstakingly collected from ship logs and farmers' diaries, would confirm the global scope of the disaster. And that, my friends, is where we must pause for now. We have only just begun to scratch the surface of this extraordinary year. We have seen the volcano erupt, felt the first snows of June, watched farmers despair and artists create monsters. But we have not yet explored the full human cost, the political earthquakes, the medical crises, the strange cultural phenomena, or the way 1816 still whispers to us today in our own era of climate anxiety. Now we step fully into the human cost, not the grand statistics, not the history book summaries, but the small, intimate, heartbreaking details recorded by people who thought they were watching the end of seasons themselves. We will walk shoulder to shoulder with farmers, mothers, children, merchants, and preachers as they faced mornings when the thermometer refused to climb above freezing even in July, when bread became a luxury measured in crumbs, when hope itself began to freeze. Let us begin in the place that suffered perhaps the most acutely per square mile, the rural counties of northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, in the summer of 1816. Open the diary of Thomas Robbins, a congregational minister living in East Windsor, Connecticut. On June 6th, he writes simply, "A severe frost this morning, great damage to vegetation." By June 8th, the entries grow longer and darker. Snow fell several inches deep and remained on the ground. The corn is cut off by the frost, many fields entirely destroyed. Robbins was not a dramatic man. He measured his words as carefully as he measured his sermons. Yet by mid-July his tone has changed to something close to disbelief. The most gloomy prospect I ever saw for the fruits of the earth. The corn is generally killed. The frost this morning was very heavy. The leaves of the trees are falling as in autumn. Walk with us now to the farm of Samuel Eastman in Vermont, Vermont. Eastman kept meticulous daybooks. On July 4th, 1816, Independence Day, he records very cold, snow squalls, ground white. 3 days later, frost again. Corn all cut off. By August, he writes the sentence that appears in dozens of similar diaries across the region: no prospect of any corn at all. In normal years, a Vermont farmer could expect 30-40 bushels of corn per acre. In 1816, many harvested 0. The stalks stood brown and brittle, tassels never formed, ears never developed. Potatoes blackened underground from repeated freezes. Squash vines withered. Even hardy rye and oats were stunted or frozen in the head. Now picture the families behind those fields. A typical Vermont household in 1816 had 6 to 8 children. Food stores from the previous year were already low after the poor harvest of 1815. When the corn died, panic set in. Parents began rationing immediately. Breakfast might be a thin porridge of ground rye mixed with whatever milk the cow still gave. Lunch was often missing entirely. Supper was boiled greens, if any could be found, and a single slice of bread per person. In many homes, the children were sent to bed with only water so the adults could eat what little remained. One anonymous letter, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society, was written by a mother in Caledonia County in late August. "My youngest, little Sarah, is but 4 years old and cries most piteously for bread. We have none. We boil the last of the potatoes with salt and call it supper. The older boys walk the woods for hours looking for berries or beech nuts, but even those are scarce. I fear winter more than I have ever feared anything in my life." Hunger brought sickness. Typhus, dysentery, and what doctors then called autumnal fever spread rapidly in malnourished bodies. In parts of New Hampshire and Maine, entire families were found dead in their cabins, too weak to seek help. Coffins became hard to obtain. Many were buried in plain boards or even blankets. Ministers reported conducting 3 and 4 funerals a week instead of 1 or 2. Yet New Englanders were stuck. They did not sit passively. In township after township, emergency town meetings were called. Some towns voted to open their poor funds early. Others sent delegations to Boston and Hartford begging for relief grain. In September 1816, a remarkable thing happened. Ships began arriving from southern ports, Charleston, Savannah, Norfolk, laden with corn and wheat purchased at high prices by charitable societies in those warmer regions. The Southern relief shipments saved thousands from outright starvation, but they came too late for many. And so the Great Migration began in earnest. Historians sometimes call 1816-1817 the Cold Year Exodus. Families hitched oxen to wagons, loaded what possessions they could carry, and turned west. They followed crude roads over the Green Mountains, through the Mohawk Valley, across the Finger Lakes region, and into the Ohio country. One estimate based on land records and census comparisons suggests that between 1816 and 1820 roughly 60,000 to 80,000 people left Vermont and New Hampshire for points west, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, even Missouri. Entire villages shrank by half, some never recovered. The town of Craftsbury, Vermont, lost nearly 40% of its population in those years, but the move west was no easy salvation. The journey itself was brutal. Late frosts continued into May of 1817. Travelers reported ice on water buckets in April as far south as central Pennsylvania. Wagons bogged down in mud. Children died of exposure or cholera caught from bad water. Yet those who reached the richer soils of the Midwest found that corn planted in June of 1817 grew tall and strong. The volcanic cooling had been strongest in the higher latitudes. The Ohio Valley escaped the worst. The frontier pushed forward faster because of 1816, not in spite of it. Now cross the Atlantic with me to the British Isles and the continent, where the suffering took a different but no less terrible form. In Ireland, the summer of 1816 was not dominated by frost but by relentless, cold-soaking rain. From May through September, there were scarcely 10 consecutive dry days. The potato crop, already the staple for 3/4 of the population, rotted in the ground. Blight had not yet reached the epidemic levels of the 1840s, but wet, cold conditions encouraged every fungal disease known to the plant. When people dug up their potatoes in late summer, they found them soft, black, and smelling of decay. The Irish poor had almost no backup crop. Unlike New Englanders, they rarely grew wheat or rye in quantity. A typical laborer's diet was potato, 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 perhaps with a little buttermilk or salt herring on Sunday. When the potatoes failed, there was nothing. By September 1816, soup kitchens appeared in Cork, Galway, and Limerick, run by local gentry and Quaker charities, but demand overwhelmed supply. In some parishes, the dead were left unburied because no one had strength to dig graves. One report from County Mayo, written by a Church of Ireland rector in October 1816, reads, "I have seen children with legs like reeds, bellies swollen from hunger, eyes sunk so deep they seem already dead. Their mothers beg for a handful of meal. I have none to give. The landlords press for rent, and the people have nothing but their rags." England and Scotland fared little better. The wheat harvest of 1816 was perhaps the worst since the 1690s. Bread prices in London doubled between June and November. In the industrial cities, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, factory workers who earned 10 or 12 shillings a week suddenly found a 4-pound loaf costing half their wages. Riots erupted. In Ely, Cambridgeshire, a crowd of several hundred stormed granaries and were fired upon by troops. 5 were hanged afterward in what became known as the Little Port riots. France, still limping from 20 years of revolution and war, faced catastrophe. The 1816 harvest was estimated at only 40% of normal. In the departments of the north and east, peasants ate boiled nettles, grass, and bark. In Paris, the price of a 4-pound loaf rose from 18 sous to 45 sous in 6 months. Crowds gathered nightly outside bakeries chanting, "Du pain, du pain." Troops were stationed at granaries. In December 1816, a mob in Rouen attacked a grain convoy. Soldiers killed 7. The restored Bourbon government imported massive quantities of Russian and American grain, but distribution was slow and corrupt. Many historians now believe the lingering economic misery of 1816-1817 contributed directly to the erosion of legitimacy that would culminate in the July Revolution of 1830. Germany, fragmented into dozens of states, suffered widespread famine. In Württemberg and Baden, snow fell in August. In Prussia, the rye crop failed almost completely. Frederick William III ordered emergency grain purchases from Poland and the Black Sea, but prices soared. In Berlin, bread riots occurred in the autumn of 1816. Cavalry charged crowds in the Alexanderplatz. Small principalities saw emigration waves as large as New England's. Thousands left for Russia's Volga colonies or North America. Across the continent, the cold and hunger produced a strange cultural phenomenon, a surge in religious fervor and millenarian preaching. In villages from Ireland to Bavaria, itinerant preachers declared that the darkened skies and failed harvests were signs of the last days. Some sects predicted the second coming in 1816 or 1817. In Switzerland, members of the radical pietist movement sold their possessions and waited on mountaintops for the end. Most were disappointed, but the emotional intensity of those months left permanent marks on Protestant communities. And through it all, the strange atmospheric effects continued to baffle observers. The sun rose blood red and set deep purple. A persistent dry fog hung in the upper air, dimming daylight even on cloudless days. In London, the poet John Keats described a season of mists and mellow fruitfulness in his famous ode to autumn, but in reality 1816 offered no mellow fruitfulness, only mist and melancholy. Artists painted sunsets of unnatural crimson. Scientists measured the haze with rudimentary instruments and could only guess at its origin. We have walked the frozen fields, stood in the bread lines, listened to the cries of hungry children. We have seen how one distant eruption turned ordinary seasons into a year-long emergency. But we have not yet examined the long shadow this year cast over politics, science, technology, and even the birth of the modern world economy. We will follow the money. We will see how 1816 helped trigger one of the first great global financial crises of the industrial age. We will watch bankers in London and Amsterdam scramble as grain prices collapsed after 1817, ruining speculators who had bet on endless scarcity. We will trace how the suffering accelerated factory building in Britain, pushing people off the land and into the mills. And we will return to the United States to discover how the Cold Year helped give birth to the Second Bank of the United States and reshaped American finance for a generation. The year the planet caught a fever of cold and humanity paid the price. If you've been with us from the beginning, you've already felt the snow in June, heard the cries of hungry children in Vermont cabins, stood in the bread riots of Paris, and watched Frankenstein take its first breath beside Lake Geneva. In Part 2, we lived inside the intimate diaries, the empty grain bins, the westward wagons creaking under the weight of despair. We ended with the promise to follow the money, because when seasons fail, economies break, and when economies break, power shifts. So today we chase the silver and gold that 1816 scattered across continents. We will trace how a volcano in Indonesia helped trigger banking panics in Philadelphia, grain price crashes in London, land speculation bubbles in Ohio, factory booms in Lancashire, and the very birth of institutions that still shape global finance nearly 2 centuries later. This is the hidden economic earthquake of the year without a summer, the part rarely taught in school, but arguably the most consequential long-term legacy of those darkened skies. Let's begin in the counting houses and coffee rooms of the City of London in late 1816 and early 1817, where the smartest and greediest men in Britain were making what they believed to be the trade of the century. By autumn 1816, grain prices had reached levels not seen since the worst years of the French Revolutionary Wars. A quarter 8 bushels of wheat in England was selling for 110 to 120 shillings, more than double the average of the previous decade. Merchants, millers, and aristocratic landowners who controlled large estates saw windfall profits, but the truly enormous money was being made by importers. Ships from Odessa, Danzig, Riga, Quebec, and New York were unloading wheat, rye, barley, and Indian corn maize at Liverpool, Hull, and London docks. Every arriving vessel was met by bidding wars. Speculators, both British and foreign, borrowed heavily to buy forward contracts months in advance, betting that the cold would persist into 1817 and 1818. They secured massive lines of credit from the private banks clustered around Lombard Street and from the Bank of England itself. One estimate later published in the Times suggested that between September 1816 and March 1817, British merchants contracted for over 1.2 million quarters of foreign grain, enough to feed several million people for a year. The financing for these purchases came largely on bills of exchange drawn at 3, 6, even 9 months' sight, all predicated on the assumption that prices would stay sky-high when the grain actually arrived. Then came the spring of 1817. As the stratospheric aerosols finally rained out and normal solar heating returned, the weather snapped back with vengeance. In Britain, the summer of 1817 was one of the warmest and driest in memory. Crops that had been planted late burst forth in abundance. The 1817 English wheat harvest was enormous, perhaps 30–40% above the 5-year average preceding 1816. At the same time, American farmers in the mid-Atlantic and Midwest, who had escaped the worst of the 1816 frosts, flooded Liverpool with cheap maize and wheat from the previous year's stores plus the new bounty. Russian and Prussian granaries spared the full volcanic winter, shipped record volumes as well. Prices collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. By August 1817, wheat in London was down to 65 shillings a quarter, less than half what speculators had paid. By November, it touched 52 shillings. The men who had borrowed fortunes to import grain now faced ruin. They could not sell their cargoes for enough to cover even the freight and duties, let alone repay the bills coming due. What followed was one of the first genuinely international commodity price crashes of the industrial era. Hundreds of grain trading houses failed in London, Liverpool, and Glasgow, but the shockwaves did not stop at the water's edge. Because so many of the bills had been endorsed and re-endorsed across Europe, the failures cascaded backward through Amsterdam, Hamburg, Bremen, Paris, and even into the counting houses of St. Petersburg. In Britain alone, an estimated 240 banks and merchant firms suspended payments or went into bankruptcy between late 1817 and mid-1819, a prelude to the far larger panic of 1825. The Bank of England, still smarting from its own wartime lending, tightened credit sharply in an attempt to protect its gold reserves. Discount rates rose. Country banks across England and Scotland, many of which had overextended themselves financing local grain dealers and farmers during the high-price years, began to call in loans. Farmers who had borrowed to buy seed and livestock in 1816 now faced foreclosure when they could not repay at the deflated prices of 1817–1818. Land values in the hardest-hit rural counties dropped 20–30% in 18 months. Across the Atlantic, the same pattern played out, only faster and more violently. In the United States, the post-war boom of 1815–1816 had been built on easy credit extended by the newly chartered Second Bank of the United States and a proliferation of state-chartered banks. Many of these frontier banks issued their own paper money with reckless abandon, much of it backed by little more than optimism and land titles. Speculators bought huge tracts in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, expecting to resell to the New England migrants fleeing the cold of 1816. When the 1817 harvest proved bountiful and European demand for American grain evaporated as British and continental fields recovered, American export prices for wheat, flour, and corn plunged. By mid-1818, cotton followed suit as British mills, flush with cheap grain and therefore cheaper labor, slowed purchases of raw cotton. The speculative bubble burst. In July 1818, the Second Bank of the United States, alarmed by the drain on its specie reserves, ordered its branches to accept only its own notes and to call in loans aggressively. State banks, unable to meet the demands, began failing in large numbers. Between 1818 and 1821, roughly one-third of all American banks either closed or suspended specie payments. Land prices in the Western Territories collapsed by 50–75% in some counties. Thousands of settlers who had borrowed to buy frontier farms lost everything. The Panic of 1819, still regarded as America's first Great Depression, had one of its deepest roots in the overproduction and price collapse that followed the anomalous scarcity of 1816–1817. But economic destruction on this scale does not merely destroy wealth, it reshapes societies and accelerates structural change. In Britain, the post-1816 price crash accelerated the already underway shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy. Small tenant farmers and cottagers, already squeezed by enclosure acts and wartime taxation, now faced ruinous rents they could not pay when grain prices fell. Many landlords, themselves burdened by debt taken on during the high price years, evicted tenants en masse, or converted arable land to sheep pasture, which required fewer hands. The result was a surge in rural to urban migration. The population of Manchester grew by nearly 40% between the censuses of 1811 and 1821. Leeds, Bradford, and Birmingham saw similar explosions. Factory owners welcomed the flood of cheap labor. Wages, already low, fell further in real terms during the deflationary years 1818–1821. Child labor intensified. 12- and 14-hour days became standard. The suffering of these new industrial workers would later be documented by reformers like Robert Owen and novelists like Charles Dickens, but the roots of that suffering lie partly in the empty grain fields of 1816 and the subsequent price crash. In the United States, the Panic of 1819 produced its own long-term political shift. Western farmers and urban artisans, furious at the Second Bank of the United States for what they saw as callous contraction, turned against the institution. Andrew Jackson, who had witnessed the suffering in Tennessee, made destruction of the bank a central plank of his 1832 presidential campaign. When he won and vetoed the Ray Charter in 1832, the bank war effectively ended centralized federal banking in America until the Civil War era. Historians increasingly trace the ideological roots of Jacksonian democracy, at least its anti-bank, hard-money wing, back to the rural distress that began with the frozen fields of 1816. Even on the other side of the world, the ripples were felt. In China, the Tambora aerosols caused serious crop failures in 1816–1817, particularly in the Yangtze Valley. Rice prices spiked, leading to local famines and unrest. The Qing dynasty, already facing internal corruption and opium problems, diverted silver to buy emergency grain imports from Southeast Asia and the Americas. That silver drain contributed to the monetary instability that would worsen in the 1820s and 1830s, helping set the stage for the Opium Wars. A seemingly small atmospheric event in Indonesia thus touched the fiscal health of the world's largest economy at the time. And in the Dutch East Indies themselves, the very birthplace of the disaster, recovery was slow and painful. Sumbawa Island was devastated, entire kingdoms erased, tens of thousands dead in the initial eruption and subsequent famine. The colonial authorities in Batavia struggled to re-establish order. Coffee and spice plantations across the archipelago suffered from the same global price volatility that afflicted grain traders in Europe and America. The Dutch colonial budget, dependent on export revenues, went into deficit for several years, forcing higher taxes and corvée labor that fueled resentment and would later feed into the Java War of 1825–1830. The money trail of 1816 has led us from ruined speculators in Lombard Street to shuttered banks in Philadelphia, from evicted farmers in Yorkshire to factory chimneys rising over Manchester, from frontier land busts in Ohio to the political birth of Jacksonian America, and even to distant fiscal strains in Beijing and Batavia. A single mountain's roar in 1815 helped rewrite banking charters, accelerate industrialization, redraw political battle lines, and plant seeds of conflict that would bloom decades later. But economics is only one lens. In Part 4, we turn to the medical and demographic story, the silent epidemic that rode on the back of hunger, the strange diseases that flourished when bodies were weakened, the spikes in mortality that official records tried to ignore, and the way 1816 quietly reshaped population geography for a generation. We will read doctors' reports from fever-ridden Irish workhouses, count the unmarked graves in New England churchyards, follow the typhus that traveled with starving migrants, and ask whether the year without a summer deserves partial credit or blame for altering birth rates, life expectancy, and even national character in the countries it touched hardest. The year without a summer. If you've stayed with us through the eruption, the impossible June snows, the empty supper tables, the westward treks, the grain price mania and collapse, the bank failures, and the acceleration of factories and frontier settlement, then you already know that Tambora's shadow was long and dark. In part 3, we followed the money until it ran dry and turned into panic. Now we must follow something even heavier, the human body count. We shift focus from ledgers and specie reserves to sick beds, graveyards, parish registers, almshouse logs, and the terse entries doctors scratched in candlelight while patients shivered under thin blankets. Because hunger does not kill cleanly or quickly. It opens doors. It invites in typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, childbed fever, and a host of opportunistic infections that physicians of the time could name but rarely cure. The year without a summer did not merely cause starvation deaths. It caused a silent epidemic wave that rolled across continents, killing far more people than the direct crop failures ever did. And because so many of those deaths were never spectacular enough to make headlines, they have been undercounted in popular memory for 2 centuries. Let us begin where the suffering was most concentrated and most merciless. Ireland in the second half of 1816 and throughout 1817. Ireland in 1816 was already a country living on the narrowest of margins. Roughly 60–65% of the population depended almost entirely on the potato for subsistence. A typical cottier or laborer family consumed 10–14 pounds of potatoes per person per day when the crop was good. When it failed, there was no fallback. The endless cold rain of summer 1816 did not bring the classic late blight fungus that would devastate the island 30 years later. Instead, it brought a wet rot combination, Phytophthora-like symptoms mixed with fusarium and soft bacterial rots that turned tubers to black slime before they could be lifted. By September 1816, reports from every province described the same horror. In County Mayo, a Church of Ireland curate named the Reverend Peter Dolly wrote to Dublin Castle, "The potatoes are universally diseased. In many districts, not 1 in 10 is fit for use. The people are eating the sound parts and leaving the rotten, but even these soon putrefy in the stomach." In Galway, a Quaker Relief Committee member recorded digging trial pits and finding a most offensive stench, the potatoes dissolved into a nauseous fluid. In Kerry, tenants were observed boiling the stalks and leaves along with the few sound tubers they could salvage. Hunger arrived first as weakness, then as edema, swollen legs and bellies from protein deficiency. Then came the fevers. Contemporary Irish physicians distinguished several: typhus fever, relapsing fever, dysenteric fever, and famine fever, a catch-all term. Modern retrospective epidemiology strongly suggests that the dominant killer was louse-borne epidemic typhus, Rickettsia prausicea, amplified by crowding in workhouses, cabins, and roadside camps as people wandered in search of food. Body lice thrive when people cannot change or wash clothing, and when malnutrition suppresses immune response. In late 1816 and early 1817, typhus burned through western and southern counties like wildfire through dry grass. One of the clearest contemporary accounts comes from Dr. John Chain, a Dublin physician who toured the West in spring 1817 on behalf of the General Board of Health. He described entering cabins where 5 or 6 persons lay on straw, some dead, some dying, all emaciated to skeletons, covered with vermin. In many places, he wrote, the living and the dead lie together for days because no one has strength to separate them. Mortality in some parishes reached 20–30% of the population over 18 months. The worst affected baronies, Murrisk in Mayo, Erris, parts of Clare and Kerry, saw local population drops of 25–40% when comparing the 1821 census to extrapolated pre-1816 figures. The fever did not stay in the cabins, it traveled with migrants. Thousands of Irish poor crossed to Liverpool and Glasgow on open-deck cattle boats, carrying lice and infection with them. In Liverpool, the fever sheds at the docks were overwhelmed by January 1817. Glasgow reported its first typhus cases linked to Irish arrivals in December 1816. By March 1817, the city recorded over 1,200 cases in a single month. Edinburgh, Greenock, and Paisley followed. In England, the infection moved inland along coaching roads and canal barges, appearing in Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham by spring 1817. London saw scattered outbreaks in the East End rookeries, though the capital was spared a full epidemic thanks to better nutrition in the southeast. Official British returns for 1817 show a national spike in fever, deaths of roughly 15–20% above the 1811–1815 average. But local parish registers in Lancashire and the West Riding tell a grimmer story. In some mill towns, burials doubled or tripled in the first 6 months of 1817. The fever killed disproportionately among the very young and the very old, but also among young adults in their prime working years, exactly the demographic that factories needed. Now cross back to North America, where the demographic impact looked different but was no less real. In New England, the direct starvation deaths were relatively few, perhaps a few hundred, because of rapid charitable imports from southern ports and because rural households kept small livestock, pigs, chickens, sheep, that could be slaughtered when grain ran out. But malnutrition still killed indirectly. Infant mortality rose sharply. In Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, parish and town records show a spike in deaths of children under 5 in the winter of 1816–1817, and again in 1817–1818. Causes listed include consumption, tuberculosis, croup, putrid sore throat, diphtheria or streptococcal infection, and dropsy, edema from malnutrition or heart failure. One particularly poignant source is the Journal of Dr. Cyrus Thompson of Kittery, Maine. Between October 1816 and April 1817, he recorded attending 87 fever cases, of which 31 died, mostly children and young mothers. He noted that the complaint seems to follow one of proper nourishment. Many families have lived on potatoes alone since September, and those half rotten. Scurvy appeared in isolated cases among people who could not afford citrus or fresh greens. One Massachusetts almshouse report from winter 1817 lists several patients with bleeding gums and loose teeth. The migration itself became a vector for disease. The thousands who left Vermont and New Hampshire in 1816–1817 often traveled in large family groups, camping in makeshift tent cities along the Mohawk Turnpike and the Genesee Road. Cholera infantum, a summer diarrhea of weanlings, and dysentery spread in these unsanitary conditions. In 1817–1818, the Ohio Valley saw localized outbreaks of bilious fever, likely malaria or typhoid, among new settlers living in low-lying, mosquito-heavy clearings. While not as dramatic as Ireland's typhus epidemic, the net effect was a measurable drop in life expectancy at birth in the hardest-hit northern states for the cohort born 1815–1820. Further south, the Chesapeake and Carolinas, regions that had exported grain to starving New England, saw a different kind of demographic pressure. High grain prices in 1816 encouraged planters to shift even more acreage to wheat and corn and away from tobacco. This required more field hands. The internal slave trade accelerated. Coffles of enslaved people marched from Maryland and Virginia into Kentucky, Tennessee, and the new cotton lands of Alabama and Mississippi. The journey itself was lethal. Dysentery, pneumonia, and exposure killed an estimated 10–15% of those transported in peak years. Historians now link part of the surge in forced migration during 1816–1818 to the temporary grain bonanza created by the northern crop failures. In Europe beyond the British Isles, the mortality picture varied by region but followed the same logic. The poorer and more potato-dependent the population, the higher the death toll. In the German states, particularly Württemberg, Baden, Bavaria, and the Hessian lands, repeated summer frosts and August snow destroyed rye, spelt, and potato crops in 1816. By winter 1816–1817, hunger typhus, hungertyphus, appeared in villages and small towns. University clinics in Tübingen and Heidelberg published case reports describing patients with petechial rashes, high fever, and delirium, classic epidemic typhus. Mortality in some rural districts reached 8–12% above normal. In the Austrian Empire, especially Bohemia and Galicia, the same pattern: failed harvests, mass begging along highways, typhus outbreaks in overcrowded poorhouses. France, despite massive grain imports, recorded a national excess mortality of approximately 100,000–150,000 in 1816–1817, compared with the 1810–1815 average. The worst affected departments were in the northeast, Ardennes, Meuse, Vosges, and the central highlands, Auvergne-Limousin, where rye and chestnut crops failed completely. In Paris itself, the Hôtel Dieu and other hospitals admitted thousands more fever patients than usual in spring 1817. Even in more distant regions touched by the aerosol veil, the demographic imprint appears. Japanese temple death registers from 1816–1817 show localized spikes in rural Honshu and Kyushu, attributed at the time to cold damage fever. In Yunnan and Sichuan provinces of Qing, China, official gazetteers note famine-related mortality and pestilence following poor rice and millet harvests in 1816. What ties all these scattered outbreaks together is not a single pathogen but a single enabling condition: severe caloric deficit. Adults need roughly 2,000–2,500 kcal/day for basal metabolism plus light activity. In the worst affected regions, daily intake fell below 1,000 kcal for months. The body responds by shutting down non-essential systems. Immune cells stop proliferating efficiently, mucosal barriers weaken, antibody production drops. Opportunistic bacteria and viruses that a well-fed person would fight off become lethal. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis do not cause famines, they exploit them. By mid-1818, the acute crisis had passed in most places. Normal harvests resumed. Fevers receded as nutrition improved, and louse populations declined with better clothing and housing among survivors. But the demographic scar remained. Birth rates dropped sharply in 1817–1819 across the affected regions. In Vermont and New Hampshire, the number of recorded births fell 15–25% below trend in those years, partly from lower conception rates during acute hunger, partly from higher miscarriage and stillbirth among malnourished mothers. In Ireland, the 1821 census revealed a noticeable missing cohort in the age band 4–8 years old compared with expectation. Across Europe, the 1816–1818 cohort was smaller and, on average, slightly less healthy in adulthood than adjacent birth years, a phenomenon now called the fetal origins hypothesis or Barker effect, where early life deprivation programs higher risk of heart disease, diabetes, and other conditions decades later. So here we pause at the edge of the graveyard. We have counted, not precisely, never precisely, the extra graves dug in 1816–1818. We have seen how hunger opened the door to fever, how fever traveled with desperate feet, how the youngest and weakest paid the highest price. The year without a summer did not merely make people cold and hungry, it made them vulnerable in ways that killed quietly, parish by parish, cabin by cabin. We will change register again. We will step out of the sick rooms and into the laboratories, observatories, and learned societies of the time. We will watch how the mysterious dim sun, the blood-red twilights, the persistent dry fog, and the global cold anomaly forced the scientific community of the 1810s to confront questions they could not yet answer. We will meet the meteorologists, chemists, astronomers, and physicians who tried, and mostly failed, to explain what had happened. And we will see how those failures slowly, over decades, laid the intellectual groundwork for modern volcanology, atmospheric science, and climate history. The year without a summer. If you've been walking this road with us from the beginning, you've already felt the ash fall on Sumbawa, shivered through June snow in Vermont, rationed the last handful of rye in Irish cabins, watched grain fortunes evaporate in London warehouses, and stood beside unmarked graves where typhus claimed entire families. In Part 4, we tallied the silent body count that hunger invited in. Now we leave the sick rooms and the churchyards and step into the candlelit studies, the smoky lecture halls, the astronomical observatories, and the learned journals of the 1810s. We are going to eavesdrop on the scientists, natural philosophers, physicians, and amateur meteorologists who lived through the anomaly and tried, desperately, imperfectly, to explain why the heavens themselves had turned hostile. Because 1816 was not only a year of hunger and death, it was also one of the greatest collective scientific puzzles of the early 19th century. The sun rose dim and coppery. Sunsets burned crimson and violet for months. A persistent dry fog veiled the upper atmosphere even on cloudless days. Frosts arrived in July. Snow fell in August. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had the conceptual framework to connect these symptoms to a single distant cause. What follows is the story of how intelligent, dedicated people grasped in the dark for answers, how they argued, experimented, measured, speculated, and ultimately failed to solve the mystery in real time, yet planted seeds that would grow, decades later, into modern climate science, volcanology, and our understanding of global atmospheric teleconnections. Let us begin in the summer of 1816 itself, in the places where the strangest atmospheric phenomena were being recorded with the greatest care. In London, at the Royal Society's apartments in Somerset House, the meteorologist and chemist Luke Howard, already famous for his 1803 classification of clouds into cumulus, stratus, cirrus, and nimbus, was keeping one of the most meticulous daily weather diaries in Europe. On June 23, 1816, he noted, "A dry haze or fog has prevailed for several weeks. The sun appears through it of a dull red color, and its light is much enfeebled." By July 10, he recorded a temperature of only 49 degrees F at 9 a.m. in central London, extraordinary for midsummer, and added, "The sky has a singular brassy or yellowish tint. Distant objects are indistinct as though seen through smoked glass." Howard measured solar intensity with a simple actinometer, a blackened bulb thermometer, and found readings consistently 15–20% below normal summer values. Across the Channel in Paris, the astronomer François Arago, working at the Paris Observatory, made similar observations. On July 5, he wrote in his notebook, "The solar disk is perfectly circular but of a deep orange hue. Its brilliance is so diminished that one can look at it without pain even near noon." Arago also noted the famous Bishop's ring, a brownish-red corona around the sun, later recognized as a hallmark of high-altitude volcanic aerosols. He speculated publicly in the journal Des Débats that some extraordinary modification of the atmosphere must be filtering the light, perhaps vapors of an unknown nature. In Germany, at the Göttingen Observatory, Carl Friedrich Gauss, yes, the same Gauss famous for mathematics, was director of astronomy. Although his primary interest was celestial mechanics, he could not ignore the weather. On August 14, 1816, he recorded snow flurries at 3,000 feet elevation in the Harz Mountains during a field trip, and noted in a letter to Heinrich Albers, "The sun appears as though viewed through a colored glass. Its heat is feeble. The barometer shows no unusual pressure, yet vegetation suffers as in deep winter." Gauss, ever the precise measurer, began comparing thermometer readings from across Europe and remarked that the cold was synchronous over an immense extent of the northern hemisphere. In the United States, at Yale College in New Haven, the chemist and meteorologist Benjamin Silliman kept a detailed journal. On July 4, 1816, he wrote, "Snow fell at intervals during the day. The air is remarkably dry notwithstanding the low temperature. A singular haze obscures distant hills." Silliman, who edited the American Journal of Science, solicited reports from correspondents across New England and published a summary in 1817 noting that the diminution of solar light and heat has been general and striking. Many observers compare the sun's appearance to that of a copper coin seen through smoked paper. Now notice something crucial. Almost none of these acute observers in 1816–1817 seriously proposed a volcanic origin. Why? Because the connection between distant eruptions and global weather was not yet part of educated common sense. The 1783 Lackey Fissure eruption in Iceland had caused a famous dry fog and crop damage across Europe, and some contemporaries, notably Benjamin Franklin, then American minister to France, had speculated that a permanent dry mist from Icelandic volcanoes might have cooled the following summer. But Franklin's idea was largely forgotten or dismissed as fanciful. The Tambora eruption itself was barely known in Europe and America until late 1815 at the earliest, and even then reports were vague and delayed by months due to slow-sailing ships and wartime disruptions in communications. So what explanations did people actually offer in real time? Sunspot/solar activity theories. The years 1815-1817 coincided with the declining phase of solar cycle 6, a period of relatively low sunspot numbers. Several astronomers, including Heinrich Schwabe in Germany, who later discovered the 11-year sunspot cycle, speculated that a prolonged minimum of solar activity might reduce the sun's output. In Edinburgh, the natural philosopher Sir David Brewster published a paper in 1817 suggesting that a temporary diminution in the sun's intrinsic splendor could account for the cold and dimness. This idea gained traction because sunspots were visible to the naked eye through the haze, appearing unusually large and dark against the weakened solar disk. Atmospheric electricity/auroral theories. Some physicians and natural philosophers linked the anomaly to the brilliant auroras observed in unusual southern latitudes during 1815-1816. In France, the physician Jean-Louis Alibert proposed that an excess of electrical fluid in the upper air had somehow cooled the lower atmosphere. Others pointed to the dry fog itself as an electrical phenomenon, perhaps related to the dry fog of 1783. Cometary or cosmic dust theories. A popular idea, especially in newspapers, was that Earth had passed through the tail of a comet or a cloud of cosmic dust. The Great Comet of 1811, Flodrigs's Comet, was still fresh in memory, and several pamphleteers claimed its debris remained in the atmosphere. In Philadelphia, the Aurora General Advertiser ran an article in August 1816 titled "The Comet's Vengeance," suggesting that fine particles from a recent comet were blocking sunlight. Human causes, war, gunpowder, and divine retribution. In more superstitious or politically charged quarters, people blamed the recent Napoleonic Wars. Cannon smoke from Waterloo and other battles was said to have poisoned the air. Religious pamphlets in Britain, Germany, and New England declared the cold summer a judgment on Europe for embracing revolution, atheism, and Bonaparte. One Connecticut sermon preached in July 1816 warned that the smoke of our sins has darkened the very sun. Chemical miasmatic theories. The most scientifically respectable alternative at the time came from chemists influenced by Lavoisier and Dalton. Some proposed that unusual quantities of carbonic acid, carbon dioxide, or azotic gas, nitrogen, had accumulated in the lower atmosphere, displacing oxygen and reducing combustibility, hence the dim sun and feeble heat. Others suggested miasmas, putrid vapors from rotting vegetation or volcanic exhalations, had spread globally. Amid all these competing explanations, a few lonely voices came remarkably close to the truth. In Italy, the chemist and volcanologist Giuseppe Saverio Poli, who had studied Vesuvius for decades, published a short memoir in 1817 in which he noted reports of the Great Sumbawa eruption of 1815 and suggested that the immense quantities of ashes and sulfurous vapors thrown into the higher regions of the atmosphere might explain the extraordinary cold and obscurity of the following year in Europe and America. Poli's paper received little attention outside Naples. In America, the Philadelphia physician and meteorologist Thomas Cooper, later president of South Carolina College, wrote in 1818 that the singular cold of 1816 may perhaps be attributed to the great eruption in the East Indies, which filled the air with fine dust that reflected the sun's rays. Cooper had read translated Dutch reports of Tambora and made the connection, but his suggestion appeared in an obscure medical journal and was ignored. The most sustained early attempt to link volcanoes and climate came slightly later, in the 1820s and 1830s, when the German climatologist Heinrich Dove and the Swiss physicist Heinrich Seeskock began compiling global temperature and weather anomalies and noticing coincidences with major eruptions, Tambora 1815, Casaguna 1835. But even they could not explain the mechanism. It would take another 150 years, until the 1960s and 1970s, for ice core chemists to detect the massive sulfate spike in Greenland and Antarctic firn layers exactly dated to 1815-1817, for atmospheric modelers to simulate how 150 million tons of sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere could form a global aerosol veil, reflect 1–2% of incoming sunlight, and cool the northern hemisphere by 0.51 degrees C for 2 to 3 years. Only then did Tambora receive full credit as the largest volcanic forcing event of at least the past 2,000 years. Yet even though the scientists of 1816–1820 could not name the culprit, their obsessive measuring, letter writing, journal publishing, and argument-fueled curiosity laid essential groundwork. Luke Howard's cloud classification became foundational to meteorology. Benjamin Silliman's American Journal of Science turned into one of the world's longest-running scientific periodicals. Francois Arago's careful photometry helped inspire later solar physics research. The very fact that so many people recorded daily temperatures, barometric pressures, rainfall amounts, wind directions, and sky colors in 1816–1817 gave later historians and climatologists an unparalleled data set. Without those thousands of amateur and professional observations, we would not have such high-resolution reconstructions of the Tambora climate impact today. Moreover, the puzzle of 1816 helped shift scientific thinking in subtle but important ways. It encouraged a more global view of weather. It made natural philosophers ask whether distant events could influence local climates. It planted the idea, still radical in the 1810s, that the atmosphere was a single, interconnected system rather than a collection of independent regional airs. In that sense, the year without a summer was one of the first great forcing events that pushed science toward a planetary perspective. So here we stand at the end of Part 5, surrounded by puzzled observers staring at a dim, red sun through a haze they could not explain, scribbling numbers, exchanging letters, proposing theories that ranged from the insightful to the absurd. They did not solve the mystery in their lifetimes, but they documented it so thoroughly and cared so deeply that their records eventually allowed us to solve it, the year without a summer. If you have followed every step so far, you have already stood in the ash-choked ruins of Tambora, felt the June snow sting your face in New England farmyards, counted the empty chairs at Irish supper tables, watched fortunes vanish in the grain pits of Liverpool, tallied the fever graves dug in haste, and listened to the frustrated arguments of scientists who stared at a dimmed sun and could not name the reason. In Part 5, we left those candlelit observatories and journals filled with measurements that would only make sense a century and a half later. Now we step sideways into a different kind of record, not numbers but images, verses, canvases, nightmares, sermons, and dreams. We enter the realm where the cold and darkness of 1816 were not merely endured but transformed into some of the most enduring art, literature, and cultural moods the Western world has ever produced. The year without a summer did not just kill crops and people, it killed optimism. It killed the easy Enlightenment faith that nature was predictable, benevolent, and ultimately under human control. In its place, it left a profound sense of nature's sublime indifference, its capacity for sudden, incomprehensible violence, its indifference to human plans. That mood, dark, introspective, awestruck, sometimes terrified, became one of the defining signatures of Romanticism at its most intense and productive moment. 1816 is therefore not only a climatic event, it is a cultural hinge. Without the endless rain on Lake Geneva, without the blood-red sunsets over London and Dresden, without the feeling that the seasons themselves had broken faith with humanity, the second generation of English romantics might never have written the works they did. Caspar David Friedrich's canvases might have been less haunted, J.M.W. Turner's light less apocalyptic, and the modern monster story might have arrived decades later, or never at all. Let us begin where the alchemy was most concentrated, the Villa Diodati on the southern shore of Lake Geneva, June 1816. The rain is incessant. It drums on the roof, lashes the windows, turns the lake into a sheet of lead. The mountains that should be visible across the water are swallowed by cloud. Lord Byron, exiled, scandal-ridden, 28 years old, has rented the villa for the summer, hoping for alpine walks and literary conversation. With him is his young traveling companion and personal physician John William Polidori, 21, ambitious, and already keeping a detailed diary. Nearby, in a smaller house called Mason Chapuis, are Percy Bysshe Shelley, 23, the radical poet recently expelled from Oxford, his 18-year-old lover Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, not yet Shelley, and her stepsister Claire Claremont, who has recently become Byron's lover and is pregnant with his child. They had planned boating excursions, hikes to Chamonix, evenings of philosophical debate. Instead, they are housebound. Day after day, the rain continues. The temperature rarely climbs above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Fires burn constantly in the hearths. They read aloud from a newly arrived volume of German ghost stories in French translation, Phantasmagoriana. The tales are crude but effective: haunted castles, bleeding nuns, vengeful spirits. One stormy night, tradition says June 16, though Polidori's diary is vague on the exact date, Byron proposes a contest. Each person will write a ghost story. Percy Shelley begins something but abandons it quickly. Claire writes little or nothing that survives. Polidori starts a tale called The Vampire, about a charismatic, aristocratic predator who drains life from those closest to him, a thinly veiled portrait of Byron himself. Byron begins a fragment about a man traveling in the Alps who meets his own doppelganger. It will later be published as a fragment and acknowledged by Polidori as the seed of his vampire story. Mary Godwin, however, is silent for days. She is pregnant, exhausted, emotionally raw after the recent suicide of her half-sister Fanny Imlay and the strain of her irregular life with Shelley. She lies awake listening to the rain and to the men arguing downstairs about galvanism. The new experiments by Luigi Galvani and his nephew Giovanni Aldini showing that electricity could make dead frogs' legs twitch, or even in gruesome public demonstrations, make the faces of executed criminals appear to grimace and smile. The conversation turns to Erasmus Darwin's theories of spontaneous life, to the possibility that science might one day reanimate dead matter. One night or so Mary later recalled in her 1831 introduction to Frankenstein, she has a waking vision. I saw with shut eyes but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. She wakes terrified. The next morning she tells the others she has thought of a story. She begins writing. What she writes is not merely a ghost tale. It is a meditation on creation, responsibility, isolation, the limits of science, the consequences of playing God, the agony of being born unwanted and unloved. The creature is not called Frankenstein, that is the scientist's name. The creature is never named. He is eloquent, sensitive, murderous only after repeated rejection. The novel is soaked in the mood of 1816. The unnatural cold, the isolation, the sense that nature has turned against its children, the feeling that something has gone catastrophically wrong with the order of things. Without the Villa Diodati summer, without the literal darkness and chill that kept them indoors and forced them into each other's minds, Frankenstein might never have existed in the form we know. Mary Shelley finished the draft in May 1817, revised it in London, and published it anonymously in January 1818. It was an immediate sensation. Reviewers were shocked and fascinated. Within a decade, it had inspired stage adaptations, and by the 1830s, it was already a cultural archetype. The modern monster, intelligent, tragic, born of science rather than supernatural evil, was born in the reign of 1816. Meanwhile, Polidori's The Vampire, published in 1819, initially attributed to Byron, much to Polidori's frustration and Byron's annoyance, introduced the aristocratic, seductive, life-draining vampire to English literature. It directly influenced later vampire fiction, including Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, and Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897. The Byronic hero, beautiful, tormented, dangerous, owes part of his existence to the same rainy confinement. The Geneva summer did not end with ghost stories. Percy Shelley, inspired by the storms and the glacial landscapes they glimpsed on rare clear days, wrote Mont Blanc, published 1817, a poem that wrestles with the sublime indifference of nature. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind, he writes, but the mountain itself is silent, uncaring, eternal. The poem is drenched in the feeling of 1816, mixed with dread. Byron, too, was deeply affected. In late 1816, he traveled to Rome and wrote the third canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, filled with stormy skies, ruined grandeur, and a sense of exile that mirrors both his personal situation and the wider meteorological exile of the year. In the famous Darkness, written December 1816, he imagines a world in which the sun has gone out entirely. I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. The poem was directly inspired by the dimmed, ashen sunsets of 1816, and by conversations about the possibility of a permanent solar decline. It is apocalyptic romanticism at its purest, nature not as nurturing mother, but as indifferent executioner. Now let us leave Geneva and follow the mood across Europe. In Dresden, Caspar David Friedrich was at the height of his powers. The winter of 1816-1817 was brutally cold in Saxony. The Elbe froze solid. Friedrich painted several works that year and the next that seemed saturated with the memory of unnatural seasons. The Sea of Ice, 1823-1824, shows a ship crushed by a vast, jagged glacier that surges forward like a living force, an image of nature's overwhelming, destructive power. Earlier works like Winter Landscape with Church, 1811, and The Monk by the Sea, 1808-1810, already carried a similar mood, but the post-1816 paintings feel colder, more final. The muted palettes, the solitary figures dwarfed by indifferent landscapes, the frequent use of ice and snow as metaphors for spiritual desolation, all resonate with the recent experience of a summer that never arrived. In England, J.M.W. Turner was also responding. His paintings of the late 1810s and early 1820s show increasingly dramatic skies, crimson, violet, sulphurous yellows, colors that eyewitnesses had described during the volcanic haze of 1816-1817. Sunrise with Sea Monsters, 1845, and many of the late Venetian scenes carry echoes of those unnatural sunrises and sunsets. Turner himself never explicitly linked the colors to Tambora, but art historians have long noted that the volcanic aerosols of the 1810s and 1830s, Tambora and Coseguina, coincide precisely with the period when his palette became most fiery and atmospheric. In Germany and Scandinavia, the cold summer fed into the Biedermeier and early nationalist movements. Poets and painters turned inward, celebrating domesticity and folk traditions as bulwarks against a chaotic natural world. In Sweden and Norway, the memory of 1816 merged with folk beliefs about Fimbulvetter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarök in Norse mythology, reinforcing apocalyptic anxieties. In America, the mood was different but no less profound. The cold summer entered oral tradition and later literature as a symbol of divine displeasure or cosmic instability. In New England, it reinforced the old Puritan sense of a world under judgment. In the frontier settlements, it became part of pioneer mythology. The year the sky refused to warm, the year the corn died standing, the year we left everything behind and walked west. The cultural legacy of 1816 ripples outward for decades. Frankenstein helps birth the science fiction genre and the trope of the mad scientist. The vampire story evolves into a major strand of Gothic horror. The apocalyptic tone in Byron's Darkness prefigures late or end-of-the-world narratives from H.G. Wells to modern climate fiction. The intensified romantic worship of sublime nature, beautiful yet terrifying, becomes a permanent feature of Western art and literature. Even fashion, manners, and social thought were touched. The damp chill encouraged heavier clothing, shawls, and fireside gatherings that lasted well into the 1820s. The hunger and unrest fed into early socialist and utopian thinking. Robert Owen's New Harmony experiment in Indiana, 1817 onward, was partly a response to the rural misery of the cold years. Malthus's essay on population, 1798, gained new urgency when people saw what a single bad season could do to food supply. And in a quieter way, 1816 helped plant the first seeds of modern environmental awareness. When nature could so suddenly and globally withhold its bounty, the illusion of unlimited abundance cracked. Writers began to speak of limits, of humanity's dependence on fragile natural cycles, of the folly of assuming permanent prosperity. So here we pause at the end of Part 6, surrounded by ink-stained pages, half-finished canvases, flickering firelight in Swiss villas, crimson skies over London, ice-bound ships in Dresden paintings, and the first faint outlines of monsters that were never born of folklore but of science and cold. The year without a summer did not merely starve bodies, it starved hope and fed imagination in its place. We will widen the lens again, this time to politics and power. We will see how the famine, the riots, the migrations, and the economic shocks of 1816-1818 weakened old regimes, strengthened others, accelerated the Congress of Vienna's conservative clampdown, fed the radical underground in Britain and France, and helped set the stage for the revolutions that would erupt in 1830 and 1848. We will ask whether the Tambora winter was one of the hidden accomplices of 19th century political upheaval. The year without a summer. If you've stayed with us from the eruptions roar to the birth of Frankenstein, from empty grain silos to fevered graveyards, from puzzled astronomers to crimson-soaked canvases, you already understand that Tambora's breath touched every layer of existence. In Part 6, we watch the cold seep into poetry and paint, turning meteorological disaster into cultural myth. Now we widen the lens to the world of thrones, parliaments, secret societies, street crowds, and barricades. Because when harvests fail on a continental scale, when bread prices triple overnight, when children die of hunger in the richest cities of Europe, politics does not sit quietly. It convulses. The years 1816-1818 were not merely an economic or climatic interlude between the fall of Napoleon and the revolutions of 1830. They were a hidden accelerant. The famine, the riots, the mass migrations, the banking collapses, and the widespread sense of cosmic betrayal weakened regimes that had only recently declared victory over revolutionary chaos, strengthened the arguments of radicals who said the old order could not feed the people, and forced governments into emergency measures that either bought time or planted deeper seeds of discontent. In this part we trace how the year without a summer became one of the quiet co-authors of 19th century political upheaval, how cold weather helped heat the revolutionary boiler that would boil over again and again until 1848. We begin in the grand conference rooms of Vienna, where the Congress that redrew Europe after Napoleon was still in session when Tambora erupted. By the time the worst of the cold summer hit in 1816, the Congress had already concluded. June 1815 had seen the final act signed, but the Holy Alliance, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and the Quadruple Alliance machinery were still very much alive. The conservative statesmen who gathered under Metternich's direction had one overriding goal: stability. No more revolutions, no more Napoleons, no more popular uprisings. The system they built rested on legitimacy, divine right monarchy, censorship, secret police, and crucially, enough bread to keep the urban masses from marching. Then came 1816. In France, the Bourbon Restoration was only a year old and already fragile. Louis XVII had returned on the baggage trains of foreign armies. Many Frenchmen still remembered him as an absentee king, while Napoleon had at least kept the tax collectors and conscription officers busy at home rather than letting foreigners occupy Paris. The ultra-royalists pushed for revenge against regicides and revolutionaries. The liberals demanded a genuine charter and press freedom. Into this tense balance dropped the worst harvest since the 1780s. Wheat yields in northern France collapsed to 40–50% of normal. Rye and buckwheat fared little better. By November 1816, the 4-pound loaf in Paris cost 45–50 sous, more than double the 1815 price, and unaffordable for day laborers earning 1825 sous a day. Crowds gathered nightly outside bakeries on the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and in the Marais. On December 3, 1816, several hundred people stormed a grain convoy near the Halle aux Blaze. Troops fired into the crowd, killing at least 7. Similar scenes played out in Rouen, Lyon, Bordeaux, and Lille. The government responded with emergency imports, Russian wheat arriving via Marseille and Le Havre at ruinous cost, and with price controls that were promptly evaded by millers and bakers. But the political damage was deeper than the immediate riots. The left liberals, Bonapartists, surviving Jacobins, began to whisper that the restored monarchy could not even keep its people fed. The right ultras blamed liberal policies, free trade, and the weakening of seigneurial rights for the crisis. Both sides used the hunger to attack the moderate center that Louis XVII was trying to hold. When elections were held in 1817 for the Chamber of Deputies, the liberal opposition gained seats despite heavy government pressure. The ultra-royalists, furious at what they saw as weakness, grew more intransigent. The seeds of the 1830 revolution, when Charles X would be chased from the throne, were watered by the empty grain bins of 1816. Across the Channel in Britain, the situation was even more explosive. Britain in 1816 was already simmering. The end of the Napoleonic Wars had brought peace, but also mass demobilization. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors thrown onto a labor market already strained by mechanization in the textile districts. The Corn Laws of 1815 had prohibited imports of foreign grain until domestic wheat reached 80 shillings a quarter, a price intended to protect landowners but which kept bread expensive even in good years. Then came the cold summer. The 1816 wheat harvest was catastrophic. Prices soared past 110 shillings. In industrial Lancashire and Yorkshire, where wages had already fallen since 1815, families spent 60–80% of income on bread alone. In the countryside, enclosure had left many cottagers without land to grow their own food. They depended on wages from seasonal farm work that now disappeared. By autumn 1816, food riots erupted in almost every county. In Ely and Littleport, Cambridgeshire, crowds attacked mills and granaries in May–June 1816. Troops fired on them. 5 men were hanged in 1817 after what became known as the Littleport riots. In Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, framework knitters smashed machines in the Luddite tradition that had flared in 1811–1812. In London, the Spencean radicals, followers of Thomas Spence who advocated land nationalization, organized public meetings calling for parliamentary reform and relief for the poor. The government of Lord Liverpool responded with repression. Habeas corpus was suspended in 1817. The Seditious Meetings Act limited public gatherings. Informers infiltrated radical groups, yet the hunger did not subside quickly enough. In August 1819, at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, a peaceful crowd of 60,000 demanding parliamentary reform and relief was charged by yeomanry cavalry. 18 died, hundreds were injured. Peterloo became a symbol of class war. Historians now widely agree that the economic misery peaking in 1816–1818, misery rooted in the volcanic winter, created the social tinder that made Peterloo possible and radicalized a generation of reformers. The 6 Acts of 1819 were a direct reaction to that tinder. They in turn fed the momentum toward the Reform Act of 1832. In the German states, the picture was fragmented but ominous. The Holy Alliance powers, Austria and Prussia, had promised stability, but the cold summer exposed the fragility of that promise. In the south and west, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, Hesse, harvests failed repeatedly. Snow in August 1816 destroyed rye and potatoes. Bread prices doubled and tripled. In rural villages, peasants refused tithes and taxes. In towns, artisans and day laborers rioted. In Württemberg, the government distributed emergency grain from state magazines, but distribution was slow and corrupt. In Bavaria, King Maximilian I. Joseph ordered price controls and import subsidies, yet local officials hoarded supplies for friends and family. The most serious political consequence was ideological. The nationalist and liberal student movement, Burschenschaften, that had emerged during the wars of liberation now found fresh fuel. They argued that petty princely states could not protect their people from famine or foreign threats, only a united Germany could. The Wartburg Festival of October 1817, where students burned reactionary books, was held against the backdrop of recent hunger. When the Austrian Chancellor Metternich learned of the festival, he accelerated plans for repression. The Carlsbad Decrees of 1819, censorship, university spies, ban on student societies, were in part a response to the unrest that had been magnified by the 1816-1817 crisis. The decrees bought short-term quiet but convinced many young Germans that only revolution could bring change. The long fuse to 1848 was lit partly by empty stomachs in 1816. In Russia, the effects were milder. The empire's vast grain lands and serf system buffered the shock, but even their Tsar Alexander I grew more conservative. The famine in Finland, then a Russian Grand Duchy, was severe. Grain imports were ordered, but the experience reinforced Alexander's turn toward mysticism and reaction after 1815. The Holy Alliance, already inclined toward intervention against liberal movements, became even more rigid. In the United States, the political fallout was subtler but no less transformative. The Panic of 1819, triggered in part by the post-1817 grain price collapse, destroyed the credibility of the Second Bank of the United States in the eyes of Western farmers and urban artisans. Andrew Jackson, who witnessed the suffering in Tennessee, turned the bank into the symbol of elite privilege. His 1832 veto of the Ray Charter Bill and the subsequent removal of federal deposits, the bank war, dismantled centralized banking until the Civil War era. Jacksonian democracy, anti-bank, pro-hard money, suspicious of Eastern financiers, drew much of its emotional energy from the rural distress that began with the frozen fields of 1816. Across the Atlantic in Latin America, the timing was coincidental but symbolically potent. Independence wars were raging in 1816-1819. San Martin crossed the Andes in 1817. Bolivar won Boyacá in 1819. Royalist armies often depended on local food supplies. Poor harvests in Spanish-controlled regions weakened their logistics. While not decisive, the Tambora climate anomaly added one more layer of hardship to populations already exhausted by war. Even in Asia, faint political echoes appear. In Qing China, the 1816-1817 rice shortages and price spikes strained local officials. Corruption scandals multiplied as magistrates embezzled relief funds. The fiscal stress contributed to the long-term weakening of the dynasty that would become visible in the 1830s and 1840s. So here we stand at the close of Part 7. The year without a summer did not cause revolutions by itself, but it made revolutions more likely. It undermined the legitimacy of restored monarchies, radicalized artisans and students, turned bread riots into political demands, forced governments into repressive overreaction, and gave liberals, nationalists, and Democrats a concrete example of the old regime's failure. The cold of 1816 helped heat the political climate for decades. We return to the land itself, to agriculture, technology, plant breeding, land use, and the first faint stirrings of what we would now call climate adaptation. We will see how farmers, agronomists, and governments responded to the shock. New crops from the Americas, improved seed selection, early experiments with greenhouses and drainage, the acceleration of fertilizer use, and the beginning of systematic weather record keeping. We will ask whether 1816 deserves partial credit for speeding the agricultural revolution that fed the exploding industrial cities of the 19th century. If you have traveled with us this far, you have already felt the ash rain on Indonesian villages, watched June snow bury Vermont corn, stood in the bread lines of Paris and Manchester, counted typhus graves in Irish workhouses, listened to scientists grasp at sunspot and comet theories, read the first pages of Frankenstein by Lake Geneva firelight, and traced how hunger turned into riots, repression, and the long fuse to 1848. In Part 7 we left the barricades and the Carlsbad decrees still smoldering. Now we return to the soil itself, to plowed fields, seed bins, manure piles, drainage ditches, experimental plots, and the slow, stubborn work of coaxing food from a suddenly unreliable planet. Because 1816 was not only a humanitarian disaster and a political accelerant, it was also one of the sharpest shocks ever delivered to pre-industrial agriculture on a hemispheric scale. Farmers, agronomists, estate owners, government ministers, and even amateur plant breeders were forced to confront the fragility of their food system in ways they had never imagined. The responses, some immediate and desperate, others slow and institutional, helped accelerate changes that were already stirring in European and American agriculture. New crops spread faster, land drainage intensified, seed selection became more systematic, fertilizer experiments multiplied, weather record keeping took on new urgency, and the first faint outlines of deliberate climate adaptation appeared. In this part we walked the fields, read the agricultural journals, follow the seed packets across oceans, and ask whether the cold summer deserves partial credit for helping feed the exploding factory cities of the 19th century. Let us start in the place where the shock was perhaps most immediate and existential, the small family farms of New England and the upland counties of New York and Pennsylvania. In normal years, a Vermont or New Hampshire farmer grew Indian corn, maize, winter wheat or rye, oats or barley, potatoes, turnips, pumpkins, beans, and enough hay to winter a few milk cows, oxen, sheep, and pigs. The corn was the cash and subsistence king, dried, ground into meal, fed to livestock, traded for store goods. When the 1816 frosts killed the corn in the tassel stage and blackened the potato vines, farmers faced not only immediate hunger but the loss of next year's seed stock. Many had to eat what little sound grain they salvaged, leaving almost nothing to plant in spring 1817. Desperation produced ingenuity. Farmers who still had a few bushels of southern corn, shipped north as relief grain in late 1816, noticed that it matured faster than their old New England varieties. The southern gourdseed and flint types from Virginia and the Carolinas, though less sweet, required fewer frost-free days. By 1817-1818, these southern strains were being deliberately saved and replanted in the north. Agricultural societies in Connecticut and Massachusetts began to advertise premiums for early maturing corn suitable for short seasons. Within a decade, the northward march of shorter season maize varieties had begun, an early practical form of cultivar adaptation to a perceived shorter growing season. Potatoes received similar attention. The Irish lumper and other late maturing types had suffered worst in the cold, wet summer. Farmers turned to earlier varieties, some brought by Scottish and German immigrants, and began experimenting with planting dates. In Maine and New Hampshire diaries from 1817-1820 show entries like sowed potatoes April 20th instead of May 10th, or hilled early to protect from late frost. These small shifts in planting calendars were among the first documented farmer-led adjustments to anomalous weather. Livestock management changed too. With hay crops stunted and corn fodder gone, many farmers slaughtered animals in autumn 1816 rather than try to winter them. Those who kept breeding stock turned to alternative feeds: pea vines, turnip tops, elm and basswood browse, even boiled nettles and acorns. The crisis accelerated interest in root crops, mangels, Swedish turnips, carrots that could be stored for winter feed. The Massachusetts Agricultural Society offered prizes in 1818 for the best yields of fodder beets and turnips, citing explicitly the late disastrous season as reason to diversify away from reliance on maize and grass hay. Now crossed to Britain and Ireland, where the agricultural response took on a more organized, top-down character. In England, the Board of Agriculture, founded 1793, and the newly influential agricultural societies had already been promoting improved farming, four-course rotations, clover and turnip catch crops, marling and liming of acid soils, selective breeding of sheep and cattle. The cold summer supercharged these efforts. The Highland Society of Scotland published emergency pamphlets in 1817 urging farmers to sow more oats and barley, which tolerated cold better than wheat, and to plant potatoes earlier under ridge and furrow systems to escape surface frost. In northern England and Scotland, the acreage under oats rose noticeably between the 1815 and 1820 tithe surveys. Turnips, already a staple of the Norfolk four-course system, gained new prestige as an emergency fodder crop. Arthur Young, the veteran agricultural writer, devoted several articles in the Annals of Agriculture, 1817-1818, to the turnip husbandry as a shield against seasons like the last. Farmers who had previously grown turnips only for sheep feed began storing them in clamps for milk cows. The practice spread southward into the Midlands during the 1820s. Perhaps the most important British response was intensified land drainage. Wet, cold summers like 1816 turned heavy clay soils into quagmires, crops drowned or rotted. James Smith of Deanston, Scotland, and John Johnstone of Cubbins, Lancashire, had already experimented with deep tile and mole drainage in the 1810s. After 1816, demand for their services exploded. By 1820, hundreds of miles of tile drains were being laid in the wettest counties. The 1840s would see Parliament pass Drainage Loan Acts, but the urgency was born in the sodden fields of 1816-1817. In Ireland, the response was more tragic and more limited. The potato monoculture was already deeply entrenched. The 1816-1817 failure did not dislodge it. Instead, the crisis accelerated subdivision of holdings. Landlords pressed tenants to grow more potatoes on smaller plots to pay rent in cash or kind. Some enlightened landlords, especially Quaker and Church of Ireland improvers, promoted oats, barley, and flax as alternatives, but these remained minority crops. The real lesson of 1816 was ignored until the far greater catastrophe of 1845-1849. On the continent, the pattern varied by region. In the German states, especially the southwest, rye and spelt had suffered worst. Agricultural academies in Hohenheim, Württemberg, and Merglen, Prussia, began systematic variety trials in 1818-1820, comparing winter-hardy rye strains from Poland and Russia with local landraces. The search for frost-resistant cereals gained momentum. In Bavaria and Austria, the crisis revived interest in buckwheat and millet, fast-growing, cold-tolerant pseudo-cereals that could be sown after a failed winter crop. France saw a burst of state-sponsored agricultural inquiry. The restored Bourbon government, embarrassed by its inability to prevent famine, created new agricultural committees and offered bounties for early maturing wheat and rye. The Société d'Agriculture de la Seine published reports urging deeper plowing, more frequent liming, and the introduction of American maize varieties. By the 1820s, maize, still called Turkish wheat, was spreading in the warmer southwest, while northern farmers experimented with earlier sowing of winter wheat to escape late spring frosts. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the westward migration triggered by 1816 carried agricultural innovation with it. Settlers in Ohio and Indiana found richer prairie soils and longer growing seasons. They brought New England maize but quickly adopted western dent corns that yielded more heavily. The crisis also encouraged diversification. more emphasis on wheat in the Midwest, more livestock, especially hogs fed on corn, and early attempts at clover and timothy hay rotations borrowed from British models. One of the most enduring legacies of 1816 was the institutionalization of weather observation for agriculture. In Britain, the Royal Meteorological Society, founded later, but with roots in the 1820s, and private weather diaries multiplied after the anomaly. In the United States, the Army Medical Department began systematic temperature and rainfall recording at frontier posts in the 1820s, partly to understand malignant fevers, but also to advise settlers on planting seasons. Farmers' almanacs, already popular, began including more detailed frost date tables and seasonal prognostications based on recent anomalies. Fertilizer use intensified too. With animal numbers reduced by the slaughter of 1816-1817, farmers turned to alternative manures, night soil from cities. The London dust trade boomed, bone meal, gypsum, lime, and seaweed in coastal districts. The first serious experiments with Peruvian guano would come later, 1840s, but the search for soil fertility alternatives was accelerated by the fear of another failed season. Seed trade became more international. American maize reached Europe as relief grain in 1816-1817. European farmers saved and replanted it, creating early hybrid zones. Russian rye and Polish oats moved westward. The botanical gardens of Kew, Edinburgh, and Paris exchanged more cold hardy varieties from Siberia, Canada, and the Alps. By the 1830s, the cumulative effect was visible. Slightly more diversified rotations, better drainage on heavy lands, earlier planting of some crops, wider use of root fodder, more systematic seed selection, and a growing network of agricultural societies and journals that treated weather anomalies as data rather than divine punishment. Did 1816 single-handedly cause the agricultural revolution? No, the four-core system, selective breeding, enclosure, and mechanization were already underway, but it acted as a powerful forcing event. It made complacency impossible. It pushed marginal farmers off the land faster, accelerating urbanization, rewarded innovators, and created a collective memory that seasons could betray humanity on a global scale. That memory lingered in seed choices, drainage maps, planting calendars, and the slow rise of agricultural science. So here we pause at the end of Part 8, standing in a freshly drained field in 1820, watching a farmer carefully select the earliest ripening ears of corn from a small experimental plot, knowing that next summer might be kind or cruel. The year without a summer did not invent better farming, but it made better farming feel urgent. We zoom out to the longest timescales, how the Tambora event is used today in paleoclimatology, ice core science, tree ring analysis, and climate modeling, how it became the benchmark volcanic winter against which we measure every major eruption since, how it informs modern discussions of geoengineering, nuclear winter, and abrupt climate change, and how studying 1816 has reshaped our understanding of volcanic forcing, stratospheric aerosols, and global teleconnections. If you have stayed with us from the first rumble on Sumbawa to the last muddy furrow turned by a Vermont farmer in 1820, you have already lived through ash clouds, June blizzards, empty cradles, bank runs, fever wards, Frankenstein's first breath, Crimson Turner skies, Peterloo cavalry charges, and the quiet revolution of tiled drains and early maize. In Part 8, we left the fields richer in knowledge if poorer in illusions, watching farmers adapt because they had no choice. Now we leap forward across 2 centuries. We enter the laboratories, ice caves, mountain tree lines, supercomputers, and scholarly conferences of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We discover how 1816 became the single most intensively studied natural experiment in the entire history of climate science, how it turned into the gold standard volcanic winter, the benchmark against which every major eruption since Krakatoa has been measured, the living proof that stratospheric aerosols can cool an entire hemisphere, and one of the key historical analogs we use when we talk about abrupt climate change, nuclear winter, solar geoengineering. And the risks of our own rapidly warming world. This is no longer a story of people in 1816 scrambling to survive. This is the story of how their suffering, carefully recorded in diaries, parish registers, ship logs, harvest tallies, temperature columns, and letters, was rediscovered, digitized, homogenized, isotope analyzed, tree ring cross dated, ice core dated, modeled at high resolution, and turned into the sharpest lens we have for understanding what a sudden massive injection of sulfur into the stratosphere really does to a planet. 1816 is no longer just history, it is data. It is calibration, it is warning. Let us begin in the cold rooms of the modern ice core laboratories, places like the Byron Polar and Climate Research Center at Ohio State, the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, the Desert Research Institute in Reno, the University of Bern, and the National Ice Core Laboratory in Denver, where scientists have spent decades drilling, slicing, melting, and analyzing cylinders of ancient ice pulled from Greenland and Antarctica. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, when high-resolution ice core analysis became possible thanks to new continuous flow techniques and mass spectrometry, researchers began to see something striking in the layers corresponding to the second decade of the 19th century. There was a massive, unmistakable sulfate spike, sharp, tall, and double-peaked in some records. In the GISB-2 core from Greenland, the acidity layer dated to 1815–1817 showed sulfate concentrations roughly 10 times background levels. In Antarctic cores Dome C, Law Dome, South Pole, the same anomaly appeared, slightly attenuated and delayed by about a year because stratospheric transport from the tropics to the South Pole takes longer. When the dates were pinned down with volcanic glass shards and tephra chemistry, the fingerprint matched Tambora ash collected from Sumbawa itself. No other eruption in at least the past 2,000 years, not Huaynaputina 1600, not Laki 1783, not Tambora's nearest rival Krakatau 1883, produced a sulfate loading anywhere near as large. That sulfate spike became the smoking gun. By the mid-1990s, climate modelers could finally simulate what happened. Using general circulation models, GCMs, loaded with 150 million tons of SO2 injected at 25–30 km altitude, researchers watched the sulfur dioxide oxidize into sulfuric acid droplets within weeks. Those droplets, submicron in size, spread in a global veil within 1 to 2 months, reflecting about 13 watts per square meter of incoming shortwave radiation back to space. The northern hemisphere cooled by 0.51 degrees C on average for 2 to 3 years, with summer temperatures in mid-latitudes dropping 13 degrees C below the pre-eruption baseline. The models reproduced the observed patterns almost perfectly: strongest cooling over the continents, weaker over the oceans, a weakened summer monsoon in South Asia, a southward shift of the intertropical convergence zone, drier conditions in parts of the tropics, and wetter conditions in parts of mid-latitude Europe. The match between model and proxy data was so good that 1815–1816 became the validation case for volcanic forcing parameterizations in every major climate model used for IPCC reports from the third assessment, 2001, onward. When Pinatubo erupted in 1991 and cooled the planet by roughly 0.5 degrees C for 2 years, scientists could compare the satellite-measured aerosol optical depth and radiative forcing directly with the reconstructed Tambora forcing, and Tambora came out roughly 3 to 4 times stronger. That comparison sharpened our confidence in the models we now use to project future warming, sea level rise, and extreme weather under different greenhouse gas scenarios. Tree rings told a parallel story. In the 1990s and 2000s, dendroclimatologists, led by people like Ed Cook, Rossen Dirigo, Keith Briffa, and Janice Spur, built millennium-length ring width and maximum latewood density chronologies from sites across the northern hemisphere. Almost every cool climate treeline record, Scandinavia, the Alps, the Rockies, the Altai, Mongolia, Labrador, showed the narrowest, densest latewood poorest rings of the past 400–600 years, exactly in 1816 or 1817, depending on growing season timing. The Tambora year became the coldest single summer reconstructed from tree rings in many of those records, often colder even than the famous 536–540 late antique Little Ice Age volcanic cluster or the 1257 Samala's eruption. Those tree ring maps revealed spatial patterns that ice cores alone could not. The cooling was strongest in northeastern North America and northwestern Europe, weaker in the Mediterranean and Central Asia, almost absent in parts of the tropics. That pattern matched what farmers had written in 1816. Snow in Vermont in June, frost in France in August, but relatively mild conditions in southern Spain and Italy. The proxies and the diaries agreed. History and paleoclimatology became co-witnesses. By the early 2000s, 1816 had been elevated to textbook status. It appeared in every volcanology and climatology syllabus as the canonical volcanic winter. When students learned about stratospheric aerosol forcing, they learned Tambora first. When they studied the difference between short-lived tropospheric aerosols, like industrial sulfate pollution, and long-lived stratospheric aerosols, like volcanic sulfuric acid, Tambora was the example. When they read about the year without a summer, they were told to remember that it was not metaphor, it was physics. The event also became a bridge between past and hypothetical futures. In the 1980s, Carl Sagan, Paul Crutzen, and others had modeled nuclear winter, the idea that massive soot injections from burning cities after a nuclear war could produce stratospheric darkening and global cooling similar to, but potentially worse than, a large volcanic eruption. The Tambora case provided the only real-world calibration point for those models. In the 2000s, when climate engineers began seriously discussing stratospheric aerosol injection, as a form of solar geoengineering to buy time against greenhouse warming, Tambora was again the closest analog. Proponents pointed to the 0.51 degrees C cooling after Pinatubo as proof of concept. Critics pointed to Tambora's crop failures, famines, and social unrest as warning that deliberate stratospheric brightening could produce similar regional disruptions: drought in the Sahel, weakened monsoons in South Asia, colder summers in breadbasket regions. Every major geoengineering paper since 2006 has cited Tambora either as supporting evidence or as cautionary tale. The year has also become central to the study of abrupt climate change and tipping points. Because Tambora was a single, well-dated impulse, it functions as a natural experiment in fast climate response. How quickly do mid-latitude summers cool after a strong forcing? How long does it take for sea surface temperatures to adjust? How do ecosystems, forests, alpine meadows, fisheries react? How do human societies adapt or fail to adapt? The answers derived from 1816 feed into our understanding of what might happen if the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation weakens rapidly, or if Arctic sea ice vanishes in summer, or if permafrost thaws and releases methane in large pulses. Tambora shows us that the climate system can shift hard and fast when pushed. In the last 15 years, the study of 1816 has grown even more interdisciplinary. Historians and climatologists now collaborate on Historical Climatology 2.0, digitizing millions of pages of old weather records, harvest dates, phenological observations, when swallows arrived, when vines flowered, and grain prices, then feeding them into data assimilation reconstructions like the PMIP Last Millennium Ensemble or the EKF 400v2 reanalysis. These reconstructions show 1816 as one of the coldest Northern Hemisphere summers of the past millennium, with anomalies that exceed 3 standard deviations in many regions. They also show the volcanic imprint in precipitation: wetter in Northern Europe, drier in parts of the United States Midwest and the Middle East. Those patterns match what people wrote at the time, and help validate the models we use to project 21st century hydroclimate change. Culturally, 1816 has been rediscovered as climate fiction precursor. Scholars now read Frankenstein not only as Gothic masterpiece but as proto-cli-fi, a story born from unnatural weather, obsessed with boundaries crossed, life-death, creator-creation, set against a backdrop of failing seasons. Byron's darkness is taught alongside modern apocalyptic narratives. The Year Without a Summer appears in museum exhibits on climate history, in undergraduate courses on environmental humanities, in popular science books, documentaries, and even video game mods that simulate volcanic winters. And in the public sphere, 1816 has become a ready reference whenever a major volcano erupts. When Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai exploded in January 2022, journalists immediately asked, could this be another year without a summer? Answer: no, Tonga injected mostly water vapor, not sulfur, into the stratosphere. When people debate geoengineering risks or the morality of playing God with the atmosphere, Tambora is the ghost at the table. So here we pause at the end of Part 9, standing in a sub-zero ice core freezer looking at a thin, cloudy layer of ice that fell as snow in 1816, its sulfuric acid still measurable 2 centuries later. We have seen how the suffering of one year became the sharpest tool we possess for understanding volcanic climate forcing, for testing models, for debating geoengineering, for calibrating abrupt change scenarios, and for reminding ourselves that the atmosphere does not negotiate. Tambora 1815 is still teaching us in 2025 and beyond. We bring everything together. We reflect on why 1816 deserves to be called one of the pivot years of modern history, not because it was the bloodiest or the most famous, but because it revealed connections that had been invisible before. A mountain in Indonesia could starve villages in Vermont, bankrupt merchants in Liverpool, inspire monsters in Switzerland, radicalize artisans in Manchester, push settlers across the Appalachians, and leave chemical fingerprints in Antarctic ice that scientists would read 200 years later. We will ask what 1816 still has to teach us as we face our own era of planetary-scale disruption, and whether we are wiser now than the people who lived through that cold summer. If you have been with us from the opening explosion on Sumbawa to the ice core labs of the 21st century, you have walked an extraordinary path. You have felt the sulfur rain on Indonesian rice paddies, shivered through impossible June snow in Vermont barns, rationed the last blackened potato in an Irish cabin, watched grain fortunes vanish in the fog of Liverpool docks, counted unmarked graves where typhus claimed the weakest first, listened to scientists of the 1810s argue helplessly over sunspots and comet dust, read the first terrified lines of Frankenstein beside a rain-lashed Lake Geneva hearth. Felt the cavalry charge at Peterloo born partly from hunger, followed the tiled drain trenches and early maize trials that farmers planted in defiance of a broken season, and finally stood in sub-zero freezers looking at 200-year-old sulfate layers that still speak of Tambora's reach. Now we close the circle. We step back far enough to see the whole shape, what 1816 really was, why it matters more than most people realize, why it deserves a place among the true pivot years of modern history, and what it continues to whisper to us in our own time of planetary-scale uncertainty. Let us begin by asking the simplest, hardest question first. Why call 1816 one of the most important years in history at all? Most people, if asked to name the pivotal years between 1500 and 1900, would point to 1492, Columbus, 1776, American independence, 1789, French Revolution, 1861-1865, American Civil War, perhaps 1848, the Springtime of Nations, or 1492 again for the Columbian Exchange. These are years of battles, declarations, constitutions, guillotines, emancipation proclamations, events driven by human will, ambition, ideology, violence. 1816 looks quieter on the surface. No armies clashed in decisive battle that year. No new nation was born. no king was beheaded, no parliament stormed. And yet the argument I have been building across these 10 parts is that 1816 deserves to stand shoulder to shoulder with those louder years precisely because it reveals something those human-driven events often conceal: the deep, structural dependence of civilization on stable, predictable natural systems. 1816 was the year the planet reminded humanity, in the most painful possible way, that we do not control the thermostat. A single mountain, erupting with no human intent or permission, injected enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to form a global reflective veil that lasted 2 full years. That veil lowered northern hemisphere summer temperatures by roughly 1 degree Celsius on average, with far larger local drops in key agricultural zones. 1 degree does not sound like much until you remember that global average temperature differences of only 0.51 degrees C separate the Little Ice Age from the medieval warm period, or that the warming we have seen since the late 19th century is already about 1.11.2 C above pre-industrial levels. Small numbers in global averages become large numbers in human lives when they manifest as killing frosts in July, rotted potatoes in September, quadrupled bread prices in December, and children too weak to cry. What makes 1816 singular is the scale and simultaneity of its consequences. Because the aerosols circled the entire planet within weeks, the cold, the failed harvests, the hunger, the fevers, the migrations, the riots, the bankruptcies, the literary monsters, the westward treks, the accelerated factory growth, the political repression, the seed selection experiments, all happened in rough synchrony across continents that had previously experienced weather as mostly local. For the first time in recorded history, enough written records existed in enough places: diaries in Vermont, parish registers in Galway, price lists in Paris, ship logs in Batavia, observatory notes in Göttingen, letters in Philadelphia, that we can trace a single causal chain from an Indonesian caldera to bread riots in Rouen, from stratospheric chemistry to the birth of Frankenstein, from aerosol physics to the Jacksonian assault on the second bank of the United States. That chain of connection is what elevates 1816 above other bad weather years. The Great Frost of 1709 killed tens of thousands in Europe, but its effects were regional. The year of the barley 1693-1694 caused famine in Scotland and Scandinavia, but not globally. The 536-540 volcanic cluster, likely Ilopango and others, plunged the late Roman world into darkness and cold, but we have far fewer eyewitness accounts. Tambora 1815 is the first truly global climatic shock for which we possess dense, multi-continental documentation, both qualitative letters, sermons, newspapers, and quantitative temperature readings, harvest yields, price series, tree rings, ice cores. It is therefore the first event that allows us to see planetary interdependence in real time. And that vision of interdependence changed things long after the skies cleared. The westward exodus from New England redrew the demographic map of the United States, accelerating settlement of the Old Northwest and feeding the belief in manifest destiny. The price crash of 1817-1819 helped discredit centralized banking in America and fueled Andrew Jackson's rise. The hunger riots and repression in Britain sharpened class consciousness and kept the reform movement alive until 1832. The German student unrest of 1817 contributed to the nationalist dream that would culminate in 1871. The legitimacy crisis of the Bourbon Restoration in France weakened the monarchy's hold and helped pave the way for 1830. Even in distant Qing China, the silver drain and local famines added one more strain to a dynasty already showing fatigue. Culturally, 1816 gave the Romantic movement its darkest, most haunted summer. Frankenstein, the vampire archetype, Byron's darkness, Shelley's Mont Blanc, the glacial terror in Friedrich's ice seas, all carry the DNA of a season that refused to arrive. These works did not merely reflect the weather, they internalized a new relationship with nature, no longer the orderly, providential backdrop of the Enlightenment, but a sublime, indifferent, sometimes murderous force that could erase human plans in a single growing season. Scientifically, the mystery of 1816 forced observers to ask questions they could not answer, but that later generations did. Why was the sun red? Why did frost come in August? Why did the same cold arrive in New England and Bavaria at almost the same moment? Those questions, unanswered in the 1810s, drove the development of global meteorology, atmospheric chemistry, and eventually climate modeling. The sulfate spike in Greenland ice became the calibration point for volcanic forcing. The tree ring minimum of 1816 became the coldest summer marker against which all other eruptions are judged. The diaries and harvest dates became grist for data assimilation reconstructions that now inform IPCC projections. In our own century, 1816 has become more relevant than ever. As we watch global temperatures climb, as heat waves break records, as monsoons shift and droughts lengthen, as wildfire smoke darkens skies for weeks, the Tambora analog reminds us that the atmosphere can still deliver surprises from the other direction. The geoengineering debate, whether to inject sulfate aerosols deliberately to offset greenhouse warming, cannot avoid the ghost of 1816. Proponents cite Pinatubo's cooling as proof of concept. Critics cite Tambora's famines, monsoon failures, and social chaos as proof of peril. Every paper on stratospheric aerosol injection since 2006 cites Tambora. Every simulation of abrupt cooling scenarios includes it as the highest fidelity historical case. More broadly, 1816 stands as a warning about fragility and connectivity in an age when supply chains circle the planet. When a drought in one bread basket can spike food prices everywhere, when a single pathogen can lock down economies, when climate tipping points threaten cascading failures. The people of 1816 did not know why their world had turned cold, but they learned, brutally, that distant events could destroy local lives. We know the physics now. We know the chemistry. We know the teleconnections. The question is whether we will act more wisely than they did when our own planetary scale experiment accelerates. So let us end where we began, with the image of a farmer in Vermont in spring 1817, opening a small sack of southern corn seed he received as relief grain the previous autumn. He does not know the name Tambora. He has never heard of stratospheric aerosols or radiative forcing. He knows only that last summer killed his crop and that this summer might do the same. Yet he plants anyway, earlier than usual, in rows a little closer together, saving the earliest ripening ears for next year's seed. Across the ocean, a Swiss naturalist sketches a glacier advancing down a valley it had not reached in living memory. In London, a bookseller unpacks the first copies of a novel called Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. In an ice sheet on the other side of the world, sulfuric acid from 1815 falls as snow, is buried, and waits 2 centuries to be drilled, melted, and measured. All of these acts, the planting, the sketching, the printing, the snowflake falling, are part of the same story. A story of dependence, vulnerability, creativity, adaptation, and memory. A story that says the Earth is one system, humanity lives inside it, and when that system is shocked, the shock waves travel everywhere, through bodies, economies, governments, imaginations, and ice. 1816 was not the bloodiest year, nor the most famous, but it may have been the year when the greatest number of people in the greatest number of places simultaneously realized that the world is smaller, more connected, and more fragile than they had ever imagined. That realization, born in hunger, cold, and wonder, ripples forward to us. It lives in our climate models, our novels, our debates about geoengineering, our maps of food security, our understanding of what it means to share a single atmosphere. Thank you for walking this long road with me. We have covered an entire year, a single volcanic winter, and 2 centuries of consequence in these 10 parts. If any part moved you, surprised you, or made you think differently about the world outside your window, please let me know. Now I want to hear from you. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that button, turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into the moments that shaped us. And drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you are watching this from, your city, your country, the room you're sitting in. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me which part of the 1816 story stayed with you longest: the birth of Frankenstein, the graves in Ireland, the ice cores in Antarctica, the westward wagons, the red sunsets, or something else entirely. I read every single comment. Your voices are what make this journey more than words on a screen. Thank you for spending these hours with me. History is not a museum, it is a conversation across time. And right now, you are part of it. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and keep looking up at the sky. Take care.